In the sweltering summer of 1851, 17 of the most powerful men in Yazoo County, Mississippi, dropped dead within the same hour. It happened during a lavish feast at Willowbrook Plantation, a celebration thrown by Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford to honor 25 years of what he called successful farming. Among the dead were judges, state lawmakers, plantation tycoons, and their kin. It wasn't long before whispers of foul play spread, and what investigators discovered shook Mississippi's elite to its core. Official records were locked away for nearly 100 years, and only recently did dusty files from the Yazoo County Courthouse shed light on what really happened. This was no accident. It was a deliberate act of revenge, planned with chilling precision. At the center of it all was Celia, an enslaved cook who had spent nearly 2 decades in the kitchen of Willowbrook. Purchased in 1833, she was chosen for her skill with food and her inherited knowledge of herbs from her grandmother, a healer from West Africa. Willowbrook was no ordinary plantation. It spanned 4,000 acres of prime cotton land, with a grand house that loomed above the fields like a monument to wealth built on human suffering. Colonel Rutherford, a war veteran turned planter, ran the estate with a twisted sense of pride. He developed a reputation for using brutal discipline masked as entertainment. Behind the mansion, he built a pavilion where guests, judges, planters, even their wives, would sip wine and feast on roasted meats while watching enslaved people whipped and tortured in carefully staged displays. He called it education. Celia cooked every meal for these events. Her kitchen stood apart from the house, outfitted with oak tables, massive hearths, and shelves stacked with jars of preserved ingredients and dried plants. From the kitchen window, she could hear every scream from the punishment pavilion. And over the years, she endured her own private agony. She had 4 children on that plantation. Her oldest daughter was sold away at age 7. Her first son was killed by Rutherford himself during one of his sadistic lessons after he was caught stealing bread. Celia's quiet grief turned into something far stronger resolve. By the summer of 1851, she had the knowledge, the motive, and the opportunity to strike back. And she did not with a gun or blade, but with a banquet that delivered justice through poison. The deadly feast at Willowbrook wasn't just murder, it was a reckoning. In the harsh winter of 1847, Celia's second daughter died at just 6 years old, her small body unable to withstand pneumonia after being forced to sleep in the freezing, unheated slave quarters. Of her 4 children, only her youngest son Marcus, born in 1844, was still alive, working long days in the cotton fields under the watchful eyes of overseers who carried both whips and pistols. Life at Willowbrook was not simply hard, it was calculated cruelty. Overseer Benjamin Harwick kept precise plantation records listing deaths, punishments, and sales of enslaved people with the same sterile detail he used for crop yields and livestock purchases. Between 1840 and 1851, 17 people died from punishment alone, while a dozen more were sold as retribution for minor infractions. One entry read, "Negro boy Samuel, aged 14, died from correction administered for insolence disposal, cost $2.50 for burial," as if the boy's life were no more significant than a broken tool. What made Willowbrook especially disturbing wasn't just the brutality. It was the pride Colonel Rutherford took in his so-called methods. He believed his system represented intellectual advancement in slave management. In letters to other planters, he described punishment as both personal discipline and public spectacle. In one dated March 15, 1851, Rutherford bragged about his techniques, writing that when discipline becomes performance, it reinforces control and deters future disobedience. He claimed his guests were always impressed, and his cotton yields spoke for themselves. Celia had watched all of this unfold from her place in the kitchen. She had served meals to well-dressed guests as they watched human suffering unfold like a stage show. She had heard their laughter and praise while children screamed from the punishment pavilion. She had seen Marcus's face frozen in fear as he watched others beaten, knowing one day he might be next. By spring 1851, something in Celia shifted. She became quieter, more focused. She spent hours tending to the kitchen garden, paying attention to plants others ignored. She began asking questions about upcoming events, who was coming, what food they'd like, what drinks they preferred. Those around her sensed she was preparing something, but no one could have imagined what it would become. On a blistering June morning, Colonel Rutherford stood on the front porch of his mansion and made a grand announcement. Dressed in white linen, he declared Willowbrook would host its most important celebration yet, a 25-year anniversary feast honoring the plantation's legacy of success and social refinement. The guest list was a who's who of Mississippi Power State Senator Augustus Pembroke and his family, Judge Thaddeus Claiborne, from Jackson plantation magnates from Madison and Hinds counties, and Cordelia Van Cleve, the wealthy widow who ran the largest cotton operation in Warren County. But what cast a shadow over the event wasn't just the names on the list, it was what Rutherford planned for entertainment. Hidden in private documents later seized by authorities, the colonel had outlined a horrific demonstration, what he called the ultimate correction. His intended subject, 7-year-old Marcus, accused of defiance after crying during a previous punishment session. Celia didn't learn of this from a direct warning, but from hushed voices she overheard while serving food to the overseer's family. The revelation didn't break her, it steeled her. She made no outward display of fear or anger. Instead, she turned to planning every move deliberate, every step measured. The feast was set for July 12th, giving her exactly 30 days. She would prepare more than just a lavish meal for the 17 guests. She would deliver a reckoning. Celia studied the guest list in detail, learning who liked wine or whiskey, who preferred sweets, who trusted her cooking too easily. She noted their routines during visits, watched their habits, listened to their comments. And while she cooked and smiled, she also gathered her tools, not knives or guns, but plants. The land around Willowbrook was full of them. Her grandmother had taught her years ago to recognize which roots, berries, and leaves healed and which could kill. That knowledge, passed down through generations, now became her weapon. From the garden, from the woods, from the earth itself, she began to collect what she needed. Her hands prepared food as they always had, but this time they also prepared justice. Knowledge passed down from generations of women keepers of both healing and harm guided Celia's hands as she prepared for the reckoning. Survival had always depended on understanding the land, on knowing which plants could soothe a fever and which could kill a man. Along the marshy eastern edge of the plantation water, hemlock grew in quiet clusters, its roots filled with cytotoxin, a deadly neurotoxin that triggered convulsions and death in hours. Castor beans thrived along the fence lines, their seeds harboring ricin, a poison slow and cruel, dragging death out over days. Oleander, beautiful but lethal, bloomed in neat rows around the main house, its flowers and leaves laced with cardiac toxins strong enough to stop a heart. But the most powerful weapon Celia found was a grove of pokeweed hidden in a ravine not far from the slave quarters. Its roots, once processed, produced a nearly tasteless powder capable of causing fatal internal bleeding. Her grandmother had told stories of enslaved women in the Caribbean who had used such knowledge to free themselves in the only way left, by taking down their masters, even at the cost of their own lives. As the weeks passed, Celia's routine subtly changed. She rose long before the others, venturing into the woods under cover of darkness to gather plants, roots, and berries. In the root cellar, she dried and processed the ingredients using techniques she had learned in childhood. Every step was risky. A misstep in preparation could kill her, before she ever served a plate. But she moved with quiet certainty. Above her, the plantation buzzed with anticipation. Rutherford ordered new uniforms for the servants, repainted the house, commissioned silver goblets, and hired a string quartet from Jackson. He spent lavishly to create a night of grandeur, blind to the fact that he was financing his own funeral. The hardest part of Celia's plan was getting the timing right. Each poison had its own pace. Some killed fast, others slowly. She needed the symptoms to start during the meal, not before, not after, when all the guests were gathered comfortable and unsuspecting. If she acted too soon, someone might survive and reveal her secret. If she waited too long, the guests might leave. After weeks of careful planning, she decided on a layered strategy. The wine would carry the fast-acting water hemlock, sparking sudden neurological symptoms. The cornbread served with nearly every meal would hold the pokeweed powder, ensuring internal damage began early but subtly. The oleander would be saved for dessert, a final fatal blow for anyone who had endured the earlier toxins. Each course would work in concert, cascading through the guests with deadly precision. In the final days leading up to the feast, Celia was as composed as ever. She prepared meals, served tea, and smiled politely at the very people she planned to bury. Her face betrayed nothing, her hands steady, her steps sure. And all the while she measured, mixed, and watched the day slip by like grains of salt through her fingers. Then the day arrived. Saturday, July 12th, 1851. Heat blanketed Willowbrook from before sunrise, thick and suffocating. Even before dawn, sweat clung to every surface. Celia was already awake. She rose at 3 as she had every day that month. But this time it was different. This time every movement carried the weight of purpose, of finality. By the dim light of oil lamps in the kitchen, she began her final preparations. This was the last day she would ever cook. The last day she would kneel to anyone. The last day she would be a slave. What she was about to serve wasn't just food, it was judgment. The night before the feast, Celia barely slept. She spent the long, silent hours going over every element of her plan, checking doses, visualizing the order of the courses, rehearsing the exact flow of the evening. She knew the timing had to be flawless. Every movement she made over the next 18 hours would have to be deliberate, calm, and undetectable. Colonel Rutherford had approved the menu himself weeks earlier, selecting dishes that flaunted both the plantation's wealth and Celia's reputation as a skilled cook. The meal would open with turtle soup, an expensive delicacy requiring 2 days of slow preparation, followed by roasted duck with wild rice dressing, venison steaks glazed in bourbon, and fried catfish crusted in cornmeal. There would be butter beans, sweet potatoes, pickled vegetables, and of course fresh cornbread. The desserts, peach cobbler and syllabub, would be served with imported wine and local whiskey. Every dish offered an opportunity, and Celia had spent weeks testing combinations in secret, using microdoses to confirm that the flavors would stay intact even as the poisons worked beneath the surface. The bitterness of pokeweed blended seamlessly into the rich broth of the turtle soup. Water hemlock with its earthy flavor vanished beneath the bourbon glaze on the venison. Oleander, deadly yet subtle, melted into the sweetness of the cobbler and creamy syllabub. Each dish was a delivery system, carefully calibrated to cause symptoms at staggered intervals, building confusion and panic as the evening wore on. That morning, the kitchen came alive with motion. Staff arrived early, unaware of what was unfolding around them. Celia moved among them like she always had, quietly giving orders, keeping control. She assigned young Sarah to arrange flowers and slice vegetables, tasks far from the dishes she'd prepared herself. Old Moses was put in charge of polishing the silverware and setting chairs, while Maria, a field hand called in to assist, tended the fires and washed pans. None of them were allowed near the food that carried her secret. Celia ensured their hands stayed clean. This was her burden alone. By midday, the first guests began to arrive. Senator Augustus Pembroke's carriage rolled up in grand fashion, led by a team of 4 bay horses with silver bells chiming softly from the harnesses. Judge Claiborne arrived next, his family traveling in a formal coach marked with the seal of the Mississippi Circuit Court. The Havenshire brothers came soon, after their loud voices spilling from the carriage, as they discussed cotton prices and the growing nuisance of Northern abolitionists. Each arrival was met on the porch by Colonel Rutherford himself, who stood sweating in his finest linen suit, greeting his guests with smiles, bourbon toddies, and florid speeches about progress, prosperity, and the blessings of Southern society. The women made their way to the parlor, fanning themselves and chatting about fabric patterns and Parisian perfume. The men retired to the side porch, puffing cigars and discussing trade policies and enforcement of slave codes. From the kitchen, Celia watched it all through a narrow window. She saw Mrs. Pembroke daintily sipping her tea, Judge Claiborne's daughter playing with a doll on the steps, and Colonel Fleming enthusiastically showing off a new type of whip to his peers. These were the people who had turned cruelty into ceremony, who applauded while children cried, who called themselves civilized while they murdered with elegance. Then came the final confirmation. At 2 o'clock, Rutherford gathered everyone on the porch and proudly declared that the evening's educational demonstration would take place at 6:30, followed by the anniversary feast at 7:30. It was exactly the moment Celia had been waiting for. With all guests scheduled to be in one place, relaxed and entertained, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. They would never see it coming, and by the time the first signs of poison began to show, it would already be too late. As the sun began its slow descent behind the oaks, casting long golden shadows across Willowbrook, Celia moved with quiet, deadly purpose. She had spent the night rehearsing this day in her mind, but now every step felt heavier, real or final. Marcus had been locked away in the punishment pavilion since the night before. Celia hadn't been allowed to see him, but his cries muffled through the thin walls of the storage shed pierced her every moment. The sound shook something deep inside her, but she did not falter. Grief could wait. Anger could wait. What mattered now was finishing what she'd started. The kitchen smelled of wealth of browned duck-sweet cornbread, simmering herbs. But beneath it all was death. The turtle soup bubbled gently in the massive iron pots, rich and savory, infused with pokeweed extract that would begin working within hours. The ducks, crisping beautifully in the oven, held a bourbon glaze hiding a fine powder of water hemlock. The venison steaks, marinated for 2 full days, were laced with enough toxin to stop even the strongest man's heart. And the cornbread, soft, golden fragrant, was a masterpiece of lethal calculation, with each slice containing a precise dose of poison that, combined with the others, would ensure a slow, painful end for everyone who touched it. By 5 o'clock, Celia dismissed her assistants, telling them she needed quiet to complete the final touches. No one questioned her. Perfection had always been her signature. But this time it wasn't pride that motivated her. It was necessity. She needed time alone for the final and most dangerous task, preparing the wine. The wine cellar at Willowbrook was a shrine to opulence. Bottles from Europe rested in dusty rows, each worth more than an entire family's yearly wages. For the feast, Rutherford had chosen 3 prized bottles of Bordeaux, supposedly acquired from a nobleman's private reserve. Celia had studied those bottles for weeks. She knew how to pull the corks without leaving a trace, how to reseal them with matching wax, how to disguise her touch beneath dust and dirt that suggested years of untouched aging. In the cool stillness of the root cellar, lit only by candlelight, She worked quickly and precisely. Into each bottle she added carefully measured amounts of hemlock extract, enough to guarantee that symptoms would begin minutes after the first toast. The liquid was clear and tasteless, undetectable even to the most refined palate. She sealed the corks, melted wax to match the original seals, then gently rubbed each bottle with soil and soot to restore their aged appearance. When she stepped back, there was no sign the bottles had ever been disturbed. Upstairs, the house buzzed with excitement. She could hear voices, laughter music, the scratch of boots on the wooden floors as the guests made their way to the punishment pavilion. Rutherford's booming voice carried clearly through the walls as he described the evening's program. His words soaked in false civility. The women giggled nervously at what they pretended to find grotesque, but secretly thrilled them. The men murmured their approval, eager to see yet another demonstration of power, cloaked in the language of order and refinement. And then came the sound. Celia couldn't ignore the trembling, frightened sobs of Marcus, her son, waiting to be made into an example. That sound cut through her deeper than any blade. But instead of breaking her, it crystallized her resolve. Her hands grew steadier. Her mind sharpened. This would end tonight. At exactly 6:30, with the sun bleeding orange through the moss-draped trees, the demonstration began. Celia didn't look outside. She didn't need to see it to know what was happening. She kept her gaze down, her focus entirely on the final preparations. Turtle soup was poured into porcelain bowls, delicate and steaming. The ducks were carved into neat portions, their glistening skin betraying nothing. The venison steaks were grilled to perfection, their seared edges hiding the death within. The cornbread was sliced into neat squares placed in linen-lined baskets, as elegant as they were lethal. Each dish, each course was set like a stage for the final act of a tragedy long in the making. This was no longer just food. It was justice plated and prepared with the care of a lifetime. And as Celia arranged the final pieces, she knew that whatever happened after tonight, no matter how the story ended, she had already changed everything. Willowbrook would never be the same. As the gruesome spectacle in the punishment pavilion reached its sickening crescendo, marked by sounds that would haunt the conscience of any soul still capable of compassion, Celia carried out the last step of her plan. In the quiet calm of the kitchen, she uncorked the 3 bottles of Bordeaux selected by Colonel Rutherford himself and let them breathe. To anyone else, this was an act of culinary grace, a gesture befitting the refinement of the Southern elite. But beneath the surface of those ruby-red vintages lay water hemlock, an invisible toxin that would soon turn celebration into carnage. At precisely 7:30, with their spirits lifted by violence and cruelty, the guests returned from the pavilion to the dining hall. Their faces flushed, their voices lively, none the wiser. Celia rang the dinner bell. What followed would not only be a feast, but the single most orchestrated act of vengeance ever carried out on a southern plantation. The Willowbrook dining room had been staged to impress. It radiated the grandeur of antebellum opulence. Chandeliers glimmered above, casting soft golden light onto polished mahogany hand-painted china and crystal goblets that sparkled with every flicker of candlelight. Oil paintings of tranquil fields and noble horses lined the walls, their pastoral calm a grotesque lie in the shadow of what had just occurred and what was about to. Colonel Rutherford stood at the head of the table, flushed with pride. To his right sat Senator Pembroke, whose political legacy was built on sermons defending slavery as sacred order. To Rutherford's left sat Judge Claiborne, dressed in formal attire now, but still wearing the cold detachment of a man who had spent decades turning away pleas for mercy. Around them, Mississippi's planter class arranged themselves according to the rules. They revered wealth first, then lineage, then utility. The Havenshire brothers, smug and loud, claimed the center discussing cotton prices and the health of newly purchased slaves. The formidable Mrs. Van Cleve, widow and magnate, sat just close enough to signal her economic power, yet just far enough to satisfy the social codes that limited even the richest women. Then, Celia emerged from the kitchen carrying the first-course turtle soup. No one paid her more attention than they would a tablecloth. Just a servant they thought moving efficiently and silently as she always had. They didn't see the woman who had spent 30 days planning their demise. They didn't recognize the mother who had just heard her son scream for his life from behind thin walls. They didn't see the mind behind the tray or the fury beneath the apron. They saw only a slave. Each guest received a bowl of turtle soup garnished with herbs that masked the subtle bitterness of pokeweed extract. They sipped and complimented the flavors, blissfully unaware of the lethal agent now slipping silently into their bloodstreams. The conversation at the table turned naturally back to the evening's educational performance. The guests praised Rutherford's technique with smug admiration. I must say, Jeremiah. Senator Pembroke declared spoon in hand, your methods never fail to impress. A calculated system of correction, exemplary, really. More owners would do well to follow your example. He spoke confidently as he took several mouthfuls of the poisoned soup, unaware that with each sip he was ushering himself toward a slow and painful death. Judge Claiborne, always precise in his words, chimed in with approval, savoring his own dose of lethal broth. Indeed, spectacle strengthens the lesson. Public punishment serves not only justice, but order. I see similar results in my courtroom. Sentencing is far more effective when seen by others. Around the table, nods and murmurs of agreement followed. They ate. They drank. They congratulated themselves on the strength of their society, on the rightness of their cause. And as they filled themselves with poison, they remained completely blind to the reckoning unfolding with every bite. Celia moved among them without a word, clearing empty bowls, bringing in the next course. No one noticed the steel in her gaze, the quiet satisfaction beneath her stillness. They had built their world on blood and chains, and now that world was beginning to devour them from the inside. The soup had gone down smoothly. Every guest at the long, glittering table had taken in a dose of pokeweed extract without the faintest suspicion. The poison was already beginning its silent work deep inside their bodies, attacking the lining of their intestines, setting the stage for internal hemorrhaging that would peak in a matter of hours. But outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. The laughter continued. The conversation flowed. Celia moved quietly among them, clearing the bowls with practiced grace, her face composed, her hands steady. No one noticed anything unusual. No one saw the weight she carried or the storm building just behind her eyes. Then came the second course, roasted duck plated in crisp slices on silver platters paired with wild rice, dressing rich with rendered bacon fat. The rice was more than a side dish. It carried a grim irony. The hogs used to make the fat had fed on acorns, gathered from beneath the oak trees that lined the punishment grounds, trees that had for decades soaked up the blood of those tortured and broken beneath them. Now the roots of that violence had come full circle, feeding the flesh that fed the feast. But the true danger lay in the bourbon glaze that coated each slice of duck. Sweet and smoky, it masked the presence of refined water. Hemlock extract doses carefully measured to provoke severe neurological symptoms within 30 to 45 minutes. Celia had prepared it to blend perfectly with the dish, ensuring that nothing in the flavor or texture would alert her targets. Every forkful was a step closer to collapse. As the guests began to eat, their conversation shifted from the evening's earlier entertainment to the larger ideas that had always justified their cruelty. Colonel Fleming, whose name alone invoked fear across Hinds County, offered a lecture on what he called the science of white supremacy. Recent cranial measurements have confirmed what we already know, he said, slicing into his duck, oblivious to the death he was placing into his mouth. Negroes possess smaller brains, particularly in regions responsible for moral judgment. It's a biological fact, confirmed by observation and by divine order, that they are inferior and therefore require guidance. Harsh discipline, even. The women chimed in with nods and smiles. Mrs. Pembroke, the senator's wife, dabbed her lips with a linen napkin as she added, "In my household, if you don't correct them daily, you lose control. There's something in their nature, idle, stubborn. They need boundaries, firm ones, or the whole structure begins to fail. What we saw tonight is essential to maintaining peace. They spoke of violence like it was etiquette. They discussed control like it was gardening. And all the while they were being undone by the very thing they thought they controlled, a woman in a linen apron who had spent her life serving their meals and had now turned that role into a weapon." Celia moved among them, refilling water, adjusting place settings, answering needs before they were spoken. She was a shadow, unnoticed, unremarkable, exactly how they had always preferred her. She listened as they shared strategies for breaking human spirits, discussed techniques for maximizing output from enslaved workers, all while savoring the food that would end them. Then came the third course, venison steaks, thick, rich, and perfectly grilled to each guest's specific preferences. Every cut had been marinated for a full day in a mixture of spices that masked any trace of the poison infused within. Once again, the bourbon reduction on top carried an additional dose of water hemlock, reinforcing the compound already beginning to take effect from the duck. The toxins were stacking each plate, a precise delivery of what would soon become unbearable pain, organ failure and death. No one tasted a thing out of place. No one sensed the shift. They were too preoccupied with their own arrogance, too certain in the permanence of their power. They believed themselves invincible, God's chosen society's elite. And so they ate, and they talked, and they laughed. And with each bite, they brought themselves closer to the reckoning. By the time the main course plates were cleared, nearly 45 minutes had passed since the guests first tasted the water. Hemlock hidden in the bourbon glaze, and the effects of Celia's intricate plan were beginning to surface. The symptoms emerged quietly like whispers in the body, easy to ignore, easy to explain away. A touch of dizziness, a faint tingling in the hands and feet, slight blurriness in the candlelit room. Nothing that raised alarms, not yet. Senator Pembroke was the first to feel something more definite. In the middle of boasting about his re-election strategy, he faltered. He pressed his fingers to his temples and chuckled softly. "This heat," he murmured. "I suppose it's wearing on me more than I expected." The room, of course, was comfortable, cooled by carefully placed windows and the evening breeze. But the heat wasn't the problem. The senator just didn't know that yet. Minutes later, Judge Claiborne reached for his wine glass and paused. His hand was trembling. He glanced at it with slight confusion, then shook it off as exhaustion. A long day of travel. The excitement of the evening. That's all it was, he told himself. But inside his body, the toxin was quietly severing the connections that allowed thought to command motion. Then came the wine. Celia emerged from the kitchen and presented the bottles with ceremony. The 3 aged Bordeaux's, each one tampered with in secret, were uncorked, poured and offered with reverence. Glasses sparkled beneath the chandelier. The aroma was rich and earthy, the color deep and elegant. No one noticed anything off. Colonel Rutherford raised his goblet and made a toast. To Willowbrook, he said, his voice proud and theatrical. To 25 years of prosperity, enlightenment, and discipline. May the next 25 be just as fruitful. Glasses clinked gently. Smiles were exchanged. And with that, 17 of Mississippi's most powerful citizens took their final drink together. Each glass held a dose of water hemlock refined to be colorless, tasteless, and fatally efficient. It would begin to shut down their nervous systems within the hour. Muscles would fail, Speech would slur, organs would seize. There would be no chance to seek help, no clarity of mind to realize the cause, and no time left to escape what had already begun. Even as the poison moved swiftly through their veins, the guests continued their conversations, still convinced of their own invincibility. Mrs. Van Cleve, the widowed cotton baroness, offered her opinion on plantation economics. Productivity, she said, between sips of the poisoned wine is entirely dependent on firm management. Too much kindness only leads to disorder. Discipline is not cruelty, it is economic necessity. Tonight's demonstration was a brilliant example of how to maintain structure and yield. They ate, they drank. They complemented the meal, the decor, and each other. And all the while, the carefully dosed compounds inside their bodies were silently converging. What had begun as tingling and dizziness was sharpening into something more insistent. By 9 p.m., the change could no longer be dismissed. The neurological symptoms triggered by the water hemlock tremors, disorientation, visual distortions were intensifying. The pokeweed introduced hours earlier in the soup and cornbread was now actively breaking down the walls of their stomachs and intestines, beginning a slow cascade of internal bleeding. The room grew quieter. The laughter softened. Eyes darted. Faces paled. Senator Pembroke, once so full of confidence and rhetoric, struggled to form sentences. His words slurred, and though he tried to correct himself by slowing his speech, it only highlighted his decline. His lips twitched unnaturally. His eyes seemed unfocused. The others noticed, but still none connected the dots. They blamed the wine, the heat, fatigue, anything but what it was. All the while, Celia stood silently in the background, refilling goblets, adjusting plates, moving like a shadow. No one saw the calm precision with which she observed them. No one realized they were dining not just in a hall of opulence, but in their own crypt carved from the very elegance they worshipped. And the reckoning was only just beginning. If this story has you on edge, share it with someone who loves dark, true tales of justice and revenge. Hit that like button if Celia's quiet resistance has left you stunned, and don't forget to subscribe for the next chilling chapter of this unforgettable night. What happens when power meets patience and vengeance is served one course at a time. We're just getting started. By the time the fourth course was served, the grand dining hall of Willowbrook had transformed into a slow-motion unraveling of power, pride, and privilege. The opulence remained. The candlelight still danced on polished silver and fine crystal. But beneath the surface, the poison was doing its work with ruthless precision. Celia's plan, months in the making, was now entering its final stages. Senator Pembroke, once so commanding in tone, could barely lift his wine glass. His hands shook uncontrollably, and when he managed to sip, half of it spilled down his collar. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the growing blur in his vision, but found himself seeing double. Faces at the table became indistinct, as if viewed through rippling water. Judge Claiborne was quietly losing control of both body and mind. He pressed a hand to his abdomen, wincing as sharp cramps knifed through his midsection. He told himself it was indigestion from too much duck or wine, but it was no ordinary discomfort. The pokeweed's saponins were now tearing into his intestinal lining, initiating internal bleeding that, though invisible for the moment, would soon become catastrophic. His thoughts drifted in and out of focus. He struggled to keep up with the conversation, often losing track of who was speaking, or even where he was. His grip on reality was slipping. The Havenshire brothers, whose booming voices had once dominated the table with talk of acreage and human capital, had grown quiet. Their faces were flushed a deep red, and both were breathing heavily, their chests rising and falling with effort. The oleander steeped into the butter used in their cornbread and seasoning their vegetables was disrupting their cardiac rhythms. The early signs of impending heart failure were unmistakable, though neither man would dare suggest anything was wrong. In their world, weakness was more dangerous than death. Mrs. Van Cleve sat stiff-backed, her face pale and clammy, her lips pressed into a tight line. Waves of nausea washed over her in unrelenting cycles, and her stomach twisted in pain. But she refused to leave her seat. She saw it as a matter of control of reputation. But she couldn't ignore the hallucinations now creeping into her senses. Shadows flitted at the corners of her eyes. Sounds arrived, strangely delayed, distorted as though spoken underwater. Her mind, once razor-sharp, was beginning to fracture. And at the head of the table, Colonel Rutherford, master of Willowbrook, champion of Southern brutality, masked as benevolent management, was visibly unraveling. He gripped the arms of his chair tightly, trying to stay upright as a violent dizziness overtook him. The room spun in waves, and each breath came with mounting effort. Deep in his abdomen, a pain was blooming sharp and relentless, his own body now betraying him as the poisons took their toll. Despite these worsening symptoms, no one cried out. No one admitted what they felt. In antebellum, Mississippi society, strength was not optional, it was everything. To acknowledge illness during a public dinner, especially one celebrating decades of perceived success, would have been unthinkable. Pride protocol and fear of appearing weak kept every guest seated at the table even as their bodies failed them. Celia had known this. She had counted on it. These people were trained to perform composure at all costs. Their need to maintain decorum delayed recognition of the truth long enough to ensure that by the time any of them realized what was happening, there would be no chance of survival. The fourth course arrived, fried catfish with cornmeal crust, golden and crisp, accompanied by butter beans seasoned with herbs that seemed familiar, earthy and fragrant. But both dishes carried death. The cornmeal crust had been mixed with additional pokeweed extract enough to push even the lightest eater over the lethal threshold. The butter beans carried a fine dusting of dried oleander leaf, ground so fine it blended seamlessly with thyme and black pepper. As Celia moved silently through the room, placing the plates with quiet efficiency, she observed what others did not: the tremors, the confusion, the sweating brows, the pale lips. This was no longer a dinner, it was a symphony of collapse. Mrs. Pembroke, seated beside her struggling husband, attempted to eat, but her hands shook violently. Her fork clattered against her plate, then fell to the floor. She forced a tight laugh. "Must be nerves," she said, her voice trembling. "So much excitement tonight." But her words were slurred, and her fingers twitched uncontrollably. The Zika toxin was attacking her central nervous system, disrupting her motor control with ruthless efficiency. Around the room, the signs were no longer subtle. They were undeniable. But still, no one moved. No one questioned. No one accused. The social mask held, but only barely. And Celia, still the invisible servant, moved quietly through the gathering of the damned, witnessing the disintegration of those who had built their lives on hers. Justice, after all, was a dish best served in silence. If you're still with us in this haunting tale of retribution and hidden revolt, now's the time to share it with someone who loves true crime with teeth. Tap the like button, subscribe for more chilling histories, and join us in the next chapter where the feast begins to descend into chaos and masks finally begin to crack. Colonel Fleming, who had once bragged about his plantation's scientific approach to discipline, was now gasping for air, his words broken into fragments between labored breaths. He clutched at his chest as the cardiac glycosides from the oleander baked into the very butter that had glazed his dinner interfered with the rhythmic function of his heart. He believed it was the oppressive Mississippi heat weighing on him, unaware that what pressed against his chest wasn't humidity, but the early onset of cardiac failure. Across the table, the younger guests were beginning to suffer in faster, more visible ways. Their youth, their lower body weight, once signs of vitality, had now become liabilities in the face of Celia's precise dosing. Judge Claiborne's eldest daughter, recently wed into a prominent Vicksburg family, tried to maintain composure even as sharp waves of pain tore through her abdomen. When a trace of blood rose in her throat, she caught it quickly with her napkin, dabbing her lips as if hiding a moment of bad manners. But it was the first external sign of internal hemorrhaging, an unmistakable symptom that the pokeweed had reached critical levels. And still, Celia moved through the dining room with the same calm and quiet grace she had displayed every night for nearly 2 decades. Her hands steady and sure cleared dishes from the previous course and replaced them with the final servings. She met no one's gaze too long. She didn't flinch at the trembling hands, the flushed faces, or the terrified glances now darting around the table. She offered no comfort, no answers, no betrayal of her role in what was unfolding. Her demeanor was deliberate, a mirror held up to them. They had long watched suffering with polite detachment, sipping wine as children screamed. Celia now returned that same performance of cold civility. She showed no emotion, not because she felt none, but because this was no longer about revenge. It was about balance, correction, a final reckoning. By now the conversation had grown stilted and fragmented. Earlier topics, politics, plantation yields, slave management strategies, gave way to awkward silences and broken exchanges. Guests mumbled incomplete thoughts, pausing to steady themselves against waves of nausea, flashes of disorientation, and creeping fear. Their voices, once commanding, had become unsure. By 9:30 p.m., the illusion of normalcy could no longer be sustained. Senator Pembroke attempted to rise from his chair. I believe I need to step outside some fresh air," he said. But when he tried to stand, his legs buckled and he collapsed back into his seat, the impact loud enough to rattle the china. His eyes widened, not from embarrassment, but from fear. "I believe I may be experiencing some form of medical episode," he said, his voice thin and shaken. That single admission broke the dam. Judge Claiborne spoke next, clutching his abdomen. "Pain? My stomach. It's become unbearable." Miss Van Cleve admitted that her vision was failing. "The room. It's wrong. It's shimmering," she whispered. The Havenshire brothers, drenched in sweat, both complained of chest tightness and shortness of breath. Their booming voices reduced to hoarse whispers. Panic crept in like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Colonel Rutherford, visibly shaken, but still trying to cling to order, stood unsteadily and attempted to assert control. "It must be the heat," he declared. "Perhaps something in the food." "Refrigeration will speak to the staff." Celia fetched Dr. Harrison immediately, but Celia did not move, because Dr. Harrison would not be coming. Hours earlier, Celia had sent a message to the doctor's residence claiming that the colonel had canceled any request for medical attendance that evening. Her note, written in practiced handwriting, explained that no physician would be required. It was a small lie with massive consequences, a single piece of misdirection that would ensure the delay of help should it even be summoned at all. By the time the plantation staff realized something was truly wrong and attempted to reach the doctor, the confusion caused by the earlier cancellation would already have set in. And Dr. Harrison, several miles away, wouldn't arrive until it was far too late to save anyone at Willowbrook. What had begun as a night of celebration, of power, of pride, of brutal legacy, was unraveling with each ticking minute. The carefully composed faces of Mississippi's elite were breaking apart. Panic was rising. Voices were faltering. And still Celia remained calm, the only person in the room with control. The poison was no longer just in their bodies. It was in the air now, in the silence between sentences, in the fear that flickered behind every forced smile. The reckoning had arrived, and no one would leave the table untouched. If this story has you breathless, you're not alone. The Willowbrook feast is only growing darker. Like, subscribe and share to follow the next chapter, where the illusion of civility collapses completely, and the ghosts of the past finally take their place at the table. By the time the grandfather clock in the parlor struck 10 heures, the genteel illusion that had held together Willowbrook's anniversary feast finally collapsed beneath the weight of agony and chaos. Celia had prepared for this exact moment, the crescendo of a symphony composed in silence and executed with precision. She had not only tampered with the food and wine, but had also arranged for the plantation's fastest horses to be relocated to distant pastures under the pretense of grazing. It was a simple lie timed perfectly, and it meant that even if someone managed to flee and raise alarm, no help would arrive in time. Minutes would stretch into hours, and by then, it would all be over. As symptoms escalated beyond denial, suspicion bloomed like smoke. It was Mrs. Van Cleve, the steely widow renowned for her ruthless business acumen, who first spoke the truth aloud. Her voice, though strained by pain, was clear. "We've been poisoned," she said. "This is not food spoilage, nor is it heat stroke. These symptoms are too severe and too uniform." Her words cut through the gasps and groans like a bell tolling in a cathedral. All eyes turned to Celia. Though Colonel Rutherford tried to interrogate her, he could barely form a coherent sentence. His speech slurred his thoughts, scrambled by the advancing effects of sicutoxin. He waved his hand vaguely in her direction, demanding answers, but it was like a drowning man trying to point the way to shore. Celia responded, as she always had, with calmness and measured grace. She tilted her head, concern etched onto her face, and suggested that perhaps the water had been tainted, or that some form of illness was spreading through the county. Her tone was so convincing, her manner so composed, that for a few final minutes her explanation bought her cover. And that's all she needed. She knew she would not survive the night. Whether by the hands of the dying or by legal noose the next day, her life was already forfeit. But that had always been the cost. The moment she learned Marcus would be sacrificed for entertainment, her own death became a bargain she was willing to strike. She had spent 18 years cooking meals for men who tortured children. Tonight she had cooked one final meal for justice. By 10 years, the dining room had become a tableau of grotesque suffering. Bodies shook with convulsions. Some guests were unconscious, others awake and groaning in confusion or terror. Several vomited blood, thick, dark, and profuse, as the pokeweed saponins ruptured their internal linings. Others gripped at their chests, their hearts skipping beats or pounding wildly, poisoned by oleander disguised in butter and herbs. Gone were the smiles, the political banter, the discussions of discipline and order. Replaced now with guttural cries, shattered crystal, and overturned chairs. The white linen tablecloth, meant to symbolize refinement and wealth, was soaked through with blood bile and wine. A celebration turned abattoir. Celia continued to stand silently, moving among the wreckage, like a ghost among the dying. At 10:30, the transformation of Willowbrook's dining hall was complete. What had begun as a spectacle of Southern power had become a stage for divine retribution. The crystal chandeliers still cast flickering light across the room, illuminating expressions twisted in fear and pain. The paintings of pastoral landscapes looked down on the carnage below now, nothing more than bitter lies framed in gold. On the floor, Senator Pembroke, once the voice of white supremacy in the state legislature, was locked in a final seizure. His body convulsed violently, arching backwards in spasms that left his limbs stiff and twisted. His mouth opened, struggling to speak, but all that emerged were garbled moans and slurred half-words. The toxin had severed the connection between thought and movement, leaving his last moments fragmented and incoherent. Judge Claiborne fared no better. His body was deteriorating rapidly. He vomited blood again and again, the sheer volume defying what seemed humanly possible. His heart lurched unpredictably, alternating between violent tachycardia and faint gasping beats. His eyes, once cold and calculating now, stared blankly, filled with panic and the dawning awareness that no law he had ever twisted in his courtroom could protect him now. What Celia had unleashed wasn't just vengeance. It was poetry and poison. Every guest was dying from the very land they had stolen, the very systems they had used to dominate others. The feast they had so proudly sat down to had become their reckoning. If this chapter left you stunned, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who appreciates true tales of poetic justice. In the next episode, we'll uncover the aftermath, how the story was buried, sealed, and nearly forgotten, and how over a century later, the truth of Celia's final stand would resurface. Stay with us. The ghosts of Willowbrook aren't finished yet. By 11:00 p.m., the carefully calculated architecture of Celia's plan had reached its devastating climax. The once impenetrable walls of Mississippi's planter aristocracy were crumbling not under the weight of rebellion, nor through political upheaval, but in the stillness of a dining room, beneath chandeliers and beside fine china as the poison did its work. The Havenshire brothers, giants of Mississippi agriculture and pioneers in the extraction of slave labor, clutched at their chests in unison, their lips turning the deep purple of terminal hypoxia. The oleander had torn through their cardiovascular systems, rendering their hearts unreliable and erratic. Each labored breath brought not relief, but terror, a vivid awareness that their power, their fortune, and their dominion over human life could not protect them from the dying pulse that now staggered inside their own bodies. Mrs. Van Cleve, once a paragon of female economic authority in the Deep South, now lay crumpled in her high-backed dining chair. Her sharp mind, once capable of managing thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved workers, was consumed by hallucinations so vivid that she spoke aloud to people who existed only within the shattered chambers of her dying brain. Her body was breaking down visibly. Blood from her nose, her ears, even her eyes, signs of internal hemorrhaging, no longer hidden by silk and pearls. Colonel Rutherford, master of the house, architect of cruelty, host of the evening celebration, was entering his final stages. The poisons had attacked him on every front: his heart, his brain, his bowels, his lungs. His body was in revolt, his blood turning toxic, his organs failing one after the next. He could no longer sit upright. He slumped sideways in his chair, then slid to the floor where a growing pool of blood expanded beneath him, and yet the worst damage was no longer physical. In the clarity of his dying brain, sharpened by the very poisons killing him, Rutherford understood. Not just that he was dying, but why. He saw with brutal honesty the system he had built. The educational demonstrations, the innovations in punishment, the years of human lives ground into profit margins. And now, all of it had returned, not in rebellion, but in methodical justice served from his own table by a woman he had never considered fully human. The younger guests died quickly, but with particular violence. Their youthful bodies fought harder, longer, and more visibly. Judge Claiborne's teenage son convulsed so violently that his bones fractured from the seizures. Mrs. Pembroke, who had spoken so confidently about the necessity of constant discipline, died in a quiet moment of horrifying clarity. Her wide, glassy eyes staring into nothing, her lips parted, as though she'd finally realized what had been done to her. Celia moved among them all. Not as a servant, not as a murderer, but as something more precise, the agent of justice. She brought water to trembling lips, comforted those still conscious, cleaned blood from faces not out of compassion, but duty. She showed them more dignity in death than they had ever shown to the enslaved men, women, and children whose lives they had destroyed. Even in their most desperate moments, these men and women were given more grace than they had ever offered others. That was Celia's final message, not revenge, but truth. By midnight, only 3 remained alive. None were coherent. They gasped or whimpered, unaware of who they were or where. Of the 18 who had gathered for the feast, 9 guests and Colonel Rutherford, 14 were now dead, and the final 3 were beyond help. The scene was grotesque. Broken glass, collapsed bodies, overturned chairs, a white tablecloth soaked red. Colonel Rutherford lingered longer than most. His size had bought him time, but not mercy. As he lay among the dead men, he had called brothers women. He had admired sons and daughters of his social empire. He felt a final, searing understanding. He had built this world, and it had destroyed him. His last thoughts were not of God or redemption, but of Celia, the cook, the slave, the woman whose name he had written only once in his ledgers as property. And yet she had outthought him, outmaneuvered him, outlived him. She had turned the tools of her oppression into the mechanism of his downfall. She had done what no court, no legislature, no military force had dared to do. At 12:30 a.m., Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford died of multi-system organ failure. In that moment, the most comprehensive act of resistance in the history of American slavery was complete. Celia, the woman erased by paperwork and ignored by power, had brought down 17 of the most influential defenders of human bondage in the South in a single night without firing a shot. As dawn broke over Willowbrook on July 13, 1851, the silence that hung over the plantation was unlike any before. The mansion stood intact. The fields remained untouched. But inside the main house, the foundations of Southern society had been shattered. What investigators would find defied belief. It was not a slave revolt. There were no escaped prisoners, no torches, no bloodshed between factions. Instead, it was elegance turned to horror. A feast transformed into a graveyard. It would take weeks for authorities to piece together even fragments of what had happened, and decades before anyone dared speak Celia's name aloud. But history would remember. If this story left you speechless, share it with someone who believes history should be told without flinching. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us for the final chapter where we reveal what became of Celia, the investigation that followed, and how this nearly forgotten act of resistance reshaped the legacy of American slavery. The morning light revealed a scene that seemed to belong more to a Gothic novel than to the Mississippi Delta. 17 corpses sat slumped around a banquet table still set with fine china crystal glasses and polished silverware. What should have been the setting for a celebration of wealth and power had become a mausoleum of Southern hypocrisy. The silence in the dining room was not of peace, but of reckoning. Celia had worked quietly through the night, not to hide what she had done, but to ensure that those who came after would understand. She cleaned the space with care, removing chaos without erasing the truth. She closed the eyes of her victims, folded their hands, and arranged them with a level of dignity they had denied to the people they enslaved. It was not forgiveness, it was order. Her final act as the orchestrator of this rebellion was not one of rage, but of solemn finality. The first discovery came just before dawn, when household staff arrived to begin their morning duties. What they found sent waves of panic through the quarters. 17 white elites dead at the table, struck down during dinner with no visible signs of violence. Some feared a disease. Others whispered of curses. A few sharper-eyed and more experienced in witnessing quiet suffering suspected poison. But none could imagine the scale, the planning, or the intellectual force behind what had occurred. By mid-morning, the news had traveled across Yazoo County like wildfire. Riders galloped between plantations, carrying word of a mass death so shocking that many assumed it was exaggerated. But curiosity and fear drove planters, local officials, and townsfolk alike to Willowbrook, where the horror exceeded even the wildest rumors. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw, a man whose most serious investigations had involved chicken theft and fence line disputes, found himself completely unprepared for what lay before him. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no bloody weapons. Just 17 dead aristocrats in a room that still smelled faintly of roast duck and bourbon. Dr. Marcus Harrison arrived around noon, visibly shaken by the sight. The same physician whom Celia had cleverly kept away with a forged message now faced the tragic consequences of his absence. As he examined the bodies, he noted symptoms of poisoning discoloration, muscular rigidity, signs of internal bleeding foaming at the mouth, blood in the airways. But this was no single poison. This was a chemical symphony. Multiple toxins administered with care and precision, each tailored to strike in a specific sequence. Someone had understood the human body, how it breathes, digests, circulates, thinks, and turned that knowledge into a weapon. As suspicion narrowed, attention turned to Celia. She made no attempt to flee. She answered questions calmly, offered timelines, and gave her version of events with quiet clarity. At first, some even doubted her guilt. But then, the investigators searched the kitchen and the cellar. What they found was not rage, but calculation. Dried herbs and roots stored in sealed containers. Tools for crushing, extracting, distilling. Hidden compartments holding parchment scraps covered in neat handwriting. The notes describe symptoms, compounds, weights, and ratios. Some passages read like a physician's manual, others like a philosopher's journal. Then they found her diary, written with care in language that was both personal and exacting. The journal chronicled every step of the plan. But it was not merely a log, it was a manifesto. In entry after entry, Celia reflected not only on the logistics of mass poisoning, but on the morality of what she was doing. She questioned herself. She assessed her targets. She dissected their words, their gestures, their justifications for violence, and measured them against her own actions. One entry dated June 20th, 1851, stood out. They believe we are animals incapable of moral reasoning. But what morality is it that applauds the breaking of children and the public display of pain? If they call that civilization, then let history record that I was uncivilized. Let it be said that I did not remain silent, that I used their own systems, their table, their wine, their appetite to return to them the consequences they have sown. The diary shattered every stereotype that had propped up the ideology of slavery. It revealed a mind that was not only literate, but brilliant. Not just thoughtful, but ethically complex. The myth of the passive inferior slave collapsed under the weight of Celia's voice, measured, strategic, and morally resolute. Authorities had no template for what had occurred. The deaths of a state senator, a circuit judge, and numerous plantation barons would paralyze legal processes and business transactions throughout the region. The investigation was quickly escalated beyond the county. State officials became involved. Newspapers cautiously referred to the event as the Willowbrook Incident, careful not to dwell on the racial implications of a woman they still refused to name. But the truth was undeniable. In a single evening, a woman once listed in plantation ledgers as property had turned the Southern hierarchy upside down. She had engineered the most thorough act of resistance in the history of American slavery, not with fire or rebellion, but with intellect, observation, and justice served by hand. This is not just a story of death, it's a story of dignity reclaimed, of intelligence unrecognized until it brought empires to their knees. Join us for the conclusion in our next episode, where we explore the aftermath of the Willowbrook massacre, the cover-ups that followed, and how Celia's legacy was almost lost to time. Like, subscribe, and stay with us, for the truth always finds a way to surface. They claim we are beasts, yet no beast tortures its own kind for profit. They say God permits their cruelty, but no true God would bless a whip. If I am to burn for what I do, I burn knowing I did not let evil reign unchallenged. Celia's Journal, June 20th, 1851. These were not the ravings of a madwoman. They were the measured, introspective writings of a woman facing her own death with clarity and conviction. Celia had not only orchestrated one of the most significant acts of resistance in the history of American slavery, she had recorded it with the precision of a philosopher, the insight of a theologian, and the moral gravity of a prophet. Her July 8th journal entry revealed her awareness of the larger system her actions would impact. I know my death will follow quickly upon theirs, but 17 fewer voices will speak for the continuation of slavery. Their absence will create openings for others, perhaps not better, but surely not worse. This passage, among many others, would shake the white population of Yazoo County to its core, not because of what it said, but because of who said it. Celia's writings were undeniable evidence of intellectual and moral complexity in a person who, by the legal standards of Mississippi, was not even considered fully human. She had destroyed 17 members of the ruling class with calculated precision. But her writings challenged something even more dangerous, the very ideological scaffolding of white supremacy, a community unnerved. For some, the discovery of Celia's writings was more disturbing than the deaths themselves. Here was an enslaved woman who not only understood the principles of chemistry, anatomy, and logistics, but who also understood ethics. She did not kill out of vengeance. She killed out of conviction, fully aware that her own death was part of the plan. Pro-slavery voices reacted with predictable horror. Editorials in Southern newspapers described Celia as a monstrous aberration, a warning against the danger of educating the enslaved. Calls grew louder for more severe laws, restricting literacy gatherings and any form of unsupervised intellectual development among black people. They painted her not as a symptom of injustice, but as a product of too much leniency. Abolitionist voices, however, saw something else. In New York and Boston, newspapers carried accounts of the Willowbrook massacre alongside editorials that described Celia as a tragic heroine, an enslaved woman who had done what no court, no government, no northern lecture circuit had been able to do: remove 17 powerful defenders of slavery from the map in one night. Her name was whispered among abolitionist societies as an example of resistance made inevitable by the violence of the system itself. Some even compared her to Joan of Arc, condemned not for evil, but for righteousness in the face of sanctioned cruelty. An unprecedented trial. Celia's arrest led to a legal proceeding unlike any in American history. Never before had an enslaved person been tried for the premeditated killing of nearly 20 prominent white citizens. The question was not just whether she was guilty, it was whether she could even be tried under the legal system of the time. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Robert Hawkins, who found himself in the bizarre position of arguing that a person legally defined as property could also possess enough moral agency to be criminally culpable. In other words, in order to sentence her to death, the state would have to acknowledge her humanity. The trial began on August 15, 1851. Presiding was Judge William Thornbrook, brought in from Jackson after Judge Claiborne's death during the massacre. The courthouse was packed. Northern reporters sat alongside Southern editors, both groups chronicling the trial with growing intensity. The room held not just Celia's fate, but the symbolic integrity of an entire legal order. Her defense was led by a team of lawyers who had volunteered after reading excerpts from her journal published in a Philadelphia newspaper. Their argument was radical, that Celia's actions constituted an act of justified resistance, that she had acted against systematic torture, that what happened at Willowbrook was not a murder, It was a response to murder repeated and institutionalized, carried out over decades. As the trial progressed, testimonies shocked the courtroom. Witnesses described the educational demonstrations at Willowbrook, how guests would watch the punishment of enslaved children while dining on fine meals prepared by Celia herself. Former servants testified to the fates of Celia's children. Her son Marcus, her daughter sold at 7, her firstborn son killed during a demonstration. Some jurors wept, others turned pale. And for the first time, the sanitized myth of the benevolent plantation was shattered under oath in front of reporters, judges, and citizens from across the state. The verdict still to come. What Celia had done could not be undone. 17 people were dead, but what remained was a question no Mississippi courtroom was prepared to answer. What happens when the system itself is on trial? Celia sat silently throughout most of the proceedings, dignified, composed, and unafraid. Her own words had already told the world everything she needed them to know. She was not expecting mercy, but she demanded to be understood. Join us next time as we conclude the saga of Celia and the Willowbrook massacre. We'll explore the trial's outcome, the political fallout, and how one woman's quiet resistance came to haunt the foundations of a nation. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe history's darkest chapters deserve to be told in full. The reckoning is not over yet. The final act of the Willowbrook massacre did not end with the deaths of 17 slaveholding elites, nor with the trial that followed. It ended in the public square of Yazoo City under a gray September sky, where thousands gathered on September 3, 1851, to witness the execution of a woman they had once considered invisible. The trial's climax. Celia takes the stand. Celia's testimony was the trial's emotional and intellectual fulcrum. When she rose to speak, the courtroom stilled. What followed stunned every person present. In words both measured and piercing, Celia gave not a confession, but a defense rooted in reason, ethics, and unshakable conviction. I knew that my actions would result in my own death, she told the court. But I also knew that the deaths of these 17 people would prevent the torture and murder of hundreds more who would have suffered under their authority. Her words did not tremble. She did not beg for mercy. Instead, she placed her accusers and the society they represented on trial. They treated human beings as animals. Yet they behaved in ways no animal ever would. I chose to end that brutality in the most efficient way possible, and I accept the consequences of that choice. Jurors deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts, was inevitable, not because there was doubt about her responsibility, but because her calm and reasoned defense forced them to reckon with the truth they had spent their lives denying. They were not ready for that reckoning. The gallows and the echo. On the day of her execution, Celia stood tall, not with the pride of a killer, but with the dignity of a liberator. Her final words, delivered from the gallows, would be quoted in abolitionist circles for generations. I die knowing that I have struck a blow for justice that will echo through history. The 17 I killed devoted their lives to the systematic brutalization of innocent people. Their deaths have ended decades of suffering and will prevent decades more. If there is justice in heaven, then God will judge between their actions and mine. And I am content to accept that judgment. When the noose tightened and her body fell, it marked more than the end of one woman's life. It marked the beginning of a story that would refuse to be buried. The fallout beyond the gallows. Celia's execution may have concluded the legal proceedings, but the impact of her actions, her writings, her voice, her defiance continued to ripple across the country. The discovery of her journal and letters had already challenged the assumptions upon which slavery was justified. But weeks after her death, plantation workers uncovered additional caches of documents hidden throughout Willowbrook letters, charts, lists of names and dates, an entire archive of suffering meticulously recorded by enslaved hands. These letters, many written in coded blends of African dialects and English, revealed a communication network that spanned counties. Enslaved people had been documenting abuses, logging family separations, and even sharing intelligence across plantations. This was not the chaos of disorganized resistance. It was methodical. It was organized. It was deliberate. Even more startling was the revelation that Celia's act had not been solitary. Her plan had been supported by a network of enslaved collaborators who helped gather toxic plants, created alibis, and watched for signs of discovery. And perhaps most alarming to the white planter class, Celia's actions were not intended to stand alone. The massacre at Willowbrook had been designed as the opening act in a broader campaign of resistance. Widespread panic among the planter class. When the coded letters were deciphered and news of their content spread, a wave of panic seized the South. Plantation owners who had for decades assumed intellectual superiority and unquestioned control now feared that the very people they owned had been planning, watching, calculating. Rumors of poison plots erupted across the region. Some were likely real. Others were panicked delusions. Regardless, white society responded with swift repression. Food tasters were introduced in kitchens across plantations. Locked pantries and storerooms became standard. Increased surveillance fell on all enslaved workers, especially those near kitchens, nurseries, and bedrooms. Whippings and arrests spiked sharply for even minor infractions as owners sought to reassert control. But beneath the fear lay a deeper realization: the myth had cracked. Enslaved people were not passive, not intellectually inferior, not incapable of moral reasoning. Celia had proven in front of jurors, journalists, judges, and God that those who were brutalized had long known the truth. And now they had shown they could fight back with discipline, with intellect, with purpose. A new symbol in the abolitionist movement, Celia's story became a rallying cry among abolitionists. Her final statement was reprinted in pamphlets, newspapers, and broadsides across the North. Speeches were written in her honor. Poets invoked her name. Activists framed her as the antithesis of the Southern slave owner, not savage but strategic, not bloodthirsty but bound by justice. To her supporters, Celia was no longer simply a cook or a victim. She was the conscience of a nation. She had been recorded as property. She had been treated as a servant. She died as a revolutionary. The Willowbrook massacre was not just a story of death. It was the story of a woman who in a single night turned the table on an empire of cruelty, and in doing so carved her name into history. If you believe her story deserves to be heard, remembered, and told, share this video. Subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories, and let us know in the comments, should Celia be remembered as a criminal or a hero? The shockwaves from the Willowbrook massacre did not end with Celia's execution. In fact, the true legacy of her actions began only after her death, echoing through the South in the form of deepening paranoia, tighter control, and desperate efforts to hold together the unraveling myth of white superiority. A South shaken by paranoia. Across the Southern plantation system, the discovery of Celia's journal letters and coded communications ignited a quiet terror among slaveholders. Plantation owners, who had long justified brutality as necessary discipline, began to reconsider the practical risks of unrestrained violence. Not out of conscience, but out of fear. If one woman with no formal education could organize such a calculated and devastating act of resistance, what might others accomplish if similarly pushed? Suddenly, cruel masters found themselves walking more cautiously. Overseers who had once operated with impunity became targets of suspicion within their own estates. Some scaled back punishment practices, worried that the next lesson in discipline might be their last. This shift had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with survival. Abolitionist triumph, Southern retrenchment. Celia's words, both written and spoken, became powerful weapons in the national debate over slavery. Northern abolitionist publications seized on her writings and courtroom testimony, reprinting them widely as irrefutable evidence of both the moral depravity of slavery and the intellectual and ethical capacities of enslaved people. Here was a woman denied education, liberty, and bodily autonomy. Yet her writings revealed a mind capable of moral reasoning, philosophical clarity, and logistical mastery that rivaled the very people who considered her subhuman. Abolitionists hailed Celia as a tragic heroine, a martyr whose sacrifice had laid bare the contradictions at the heart of America's most violent institution. In contrast, Southern voices responded with defensive fury. Editorials branded Celia a monstrous anomaly. Politicians called for tighter control bans on slave literacy, harsher penalties for disobedience, more vigilant surveillance. The sophistication of Celia's actions, far from being admired, was treated as a warning. Education among the enslaved was no longer just threatening, it was revolutionary. This case intensified the political polarization of the 1850s, contributing directly to the tensions that would ignite the Civil War. It forced the South to confront a truth. It could no longer comfortably ignore the enslaved were not passive. They were thinking, watching, and waiting. Post-war investigations and the ghosts of Willowbrook. In the 1860s, during the Union occupation of Mississippi, federal investigators reopened the Willowbrook case files. What they found only deepened the historical importance of what Celia had done. Previously suppressed testimonies from enslaved witnesses were uncovered, revealing just how much of Celia's plan had been intentionally concealed during the trial. More importantly, they found evidence that Willowbrook had not been an isolated case, but the spark of a larger, organized network of resistance across the South. Among the most staggering discoveries was a detailed hand-drawn map in Celia's own script, marking the locations of dozens of mass graves across Yazoo County. The map included names, dates, and causes of death painstakingly recorded by someone who had witnessed decades of sanctioned murder and refused to let the dead be forgotten. Federal agents and archaeologists working with local freedmen began to exhume the sites. What they found horrified even seasoned medical personnel: human remains bearing signs of torture, mutilation, whipping, and execution. The physical evidence perfectly matched the accounts in Celia's journal and the coded letters shared among enslaved people. Reconstruction and unfinished justice. The discoveries led to a series of posthumous legal proceedings in the Reconstruction era. Plantations were seized. Some of the land was redistributed to formerly enslaved people. Others were transformed into memorial grounds, though these efforts were short-lived. As federal occupation ended in the 1870s, the political will to pursue justice faded, replaced by the rise of Jim Crow and the Southern effort to bury the past once again. Still, the historical record could no longer be erased. Celia had left behind more than a story. She had left proof, a forensic, philosophical, and human archive of what slavery truly was. A legacy etched in fire and ink. Modern historians now view the Willowbrook massacre not just as an act of resistance, but as a singular, sophisticated operation that combined tactical planning, scientific knowledge, psychological insight, and moral clarity in a way that rivaled military campaigns of the Civil War. Celia was more than a rebel. She was a strategist who timed poison dosages with the precision of a battlefield commander. A scientist who understood the chemical properties of native plants and their effects on human anatomy. A writer whose journal entries offer a window into the emotional and intellectual world of the enslaved. A moral philosopher who justified her actions not with vengeance, but with the goal of preventing further harm. A revolutionary whose actions triggered changes in law policy and the psychological fabric of Southern society. Her final argument that violence against oppressors can be morally justified when it prevents greater violence against the innocent remains a subject of study in ethics classrooms today. Final thought: Celia died at the end of a rope. But she also carved her name into the roots of history deeper than any plantation foundation louder than any senator's speech and more enduring than the system she destroyed from within. The 17 she killed were not just victims of poison. They were victims of their own brutality, returned to them by a woman they refused to see as human until it was too late. If her story moved, you don't let it be forgotten again. Share this series, subscribe, and in the comments tell us, what does justice look like when the system itself is criminal? The Willowbrook massacre stands as a powerful reminder that resistance doesn't always look like open rebellion. Sometimes it's quiet, calculated, and deeply personal. What Celia did wasn't just shocking. It was one of the most effective acts of resistance in American history. By ending the lives of 17 powerful figures who upheld and profited from slavery, she didn't just take revenge, she disrupted a system. These were people whose influence would have ensured the continued suffering of hundreds, maybe thousands of enslaved individuals. And yet, in the face of overwhelming oppression, Celia found a way to fight back, even knowing the cost would be her own life. Her story shows us that intelligence, moral clarity, and strategic thinking don't belong to any one class or race. They are human qualities that no law or social system can truly erase. But there's still so much we don't know. The official records were sealed for almost 100 years. Some historians believe that key evidence may still be hidden in private letters or forgotten family archives. Could there have been others who helped Celia and escaped? Were there similar resistance networks that existed across other plantations, but were never uncovered? Her story continues to spark questions about how enslaved people resisted in ways that went far beyond what history books have recorded. Celia's deadly dinner wasn't just about vengeance. It was a carefully planned act of justice carried out by a woman who had been denied her basic humanity and chose not to accept that fate. On that humid summer night in 1851, some of the most powerful voices defending slavery in Mississippi were silenced forever. Whether you see it as cold-blooded murder or a desperate act of justice, Celia proved that even under the harshest conditions, people still have the power to choose courage, to choose action, and to make history. Her final act still challenges us to think hard about what justice really means and what freedom is worth. More than 170 years later, her story still echoes. So what do you think? Was everything truly revealed? Could there still be more to uncover? Let us know in the comments. And if this story pulled you in, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who loves uncovering the forgotten truths of American history. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll dig into another chapter the past tried to bury.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.